Welcome to Business Talk, a global podcast series where we bring you closer to some of the world's most distinguished scholars and their impactful ideas. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Samuel Moyn to Business Talk, not just as a distinguished guest, but as a thinker who has spent his career asking some of the hardest questions about our political and moral world. From the classrooms and seminar halls of Yale University, where he serves as a Kent professor of law and history, and heads Grace Hooper College. His work has consistently pushed students and readers to rethink what they take for granted about rights, democracy, and war. Trained in modern European intellectual history, Professor Samuel has long been drawn to the big, uncomfortable questions. How did human rights become the moral language of our time? Why has the pursuit of justice so often coexisted with deepening inequality? And how have laws of war made conflicts more humane without necessarily making it less frequent? These questions animate his influential books, from The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, and Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World, to Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. In Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals and the Making of Our Times, he turns his attention to the intellectual architects of the post-war order, probing how their ideas continue to shape our present. But Professor Samuel Moyn is not only a scholar writing for specialists. Over the years, he has stepped again and again into the public sphere. He is using his voice to speak to much a wider audience. His essays have appeared in venues such as The Atlantic, Boston Review, The Chronicle of Higher Education, Commonweal, Dissent, and Guardian, the London Review of Books, The Nation, The New Republic, and the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, as well as through his affiliation with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Across this platform, he has become a trusted guide for readers trying to make sense of war, power, and the often hidden moral assumptions behind our politics. Today, he joins us to discuss his latest book, Gerontocracy in America, How the Old Hoard Power and Wealth and What to Do About It. In this new work, Professor Moyn turns his historical and philosophical lens on one of the most pressing and contentious issues in contemporary American life, the concentration of political and economic power in the hands of the old and what it means for democracy, fairness in the future. For a podcast like Business Talk, where we explore the deeper forces shaping institutions, leadership, and policy, this conversation could not be more timely. Professor Moyn, we are truly delighted to have you on Business Talk. The honor, without question, is entirely ours. Thank you so much.
Well, it's a privilege, and you gave a lovely introduction, and I'm very grateful for the invitation.
Thank you. Professor, in Gerontocracy in America, you argue that the United States has become, in effect, an oligarchy where power and wealth are disproportionately held by the elderly. When you begin this project, what was the single most striking piece of evidence that convinced you this was not just a perception problem, but a structural crisis?
Well, I started out where most Americans are today, with the perception that their political leaders are too old because they're subject to cognitive decline or death, as the recent president, Joe Biden, or many in the Democratic Party. Most recently, a senator died the other day. And I began to wonder if it went deeper than just the political class, because, um, you know, actually more than half of humanity lives under a political leader over the age of 70. And that's in large part not because of my country, but because of yours and because of China and Russia. All of those have had leaders age over 70. But when I looked at the American case, of course, there were some specific reasons why the politicians were so old, which have to do with the power of incumbency. But then I looked deeper at just the kind of social power that older people exercise, including through voting and through holding wealth. So the single most striking domain of this, I think, which convinced me it was a structural issue, is actually housing. Because as I write in the book, older people go to the meetings where the zoning decisions are made in our country and they block housing, including senior appropriate housing. So there's a big discourse about the crisis of supply of housing, and it's really due to that obstructionism. And then older people stay in their homes even when their children are long gone. And it turns out that the most likely age group to own a home in the United States right now is those aged 70 to 74. And the second most likely group to own a home is 75 and older. And so we really have almost a monopoly of control of housing by older people. And that's just an example of the stranglehold that they've acquired over many sources of power.
Professor, you write that age has become the modality in which class is lived in America today, suggesting that age now channels and expresses deeper inequalities. Could you unpack what you mean by that and how seeing age and class together changes how we understand contemporary American capitalism?
It's a really important question, and it's really transcends my country because if you believe in inequality, you have to decide how to study it. And I cite a great British thinker named Stuart Hall, who famously said, "We can't take a vulgar Marxist position and say that class is all that matters because it begs the question of how class is made in whatever place and time." And of course, he was interested in showing that it wasn't an accident that those who were racially subordinated were also poorer. And so I adapted his thinking because I concluded that you can't understand class without taking age into account. Um, if we look globally, because again, I don't want to make this podcast just about one country, even though that's what I decided to write about. If you look at the billionaires on the world stage, those who have at least 1 billion in dollar terms, well, 90% of them are over the age of 50. And half of those, so 45% of billionaires, are over the age of 70. And that's not an accident. Partly it's that we all think that as you age, you get more, at least up to a point. But it's gone so far that we should see how age is like a political factor in the establishment of class hierarchy. And then we have to decide, well, is that justified? And if not, should we do something about it? But my main point was that we can't understand inequality without taking age into account.
Professor, you show that it is not only the presidency, but Congress, the courts, and corporate leadership where average ages have risen sharply. What do we lose democratically and substantively when the key institutions of law, policy, and business are increasingly dominated by people several generations older than those most affected by their decisions?
Well, let me distinguish but among those groups. So just take the political class. So that includes judges, those who are serving in political office, as distinct from the business leaders. I have a few criticisms of the like agedness of the political leaders. One I already mentioned, and Americans are very familiar with it now. There's the age, with age comes the risk of cognitive decline. And Joe Biden famously suffered from that and in a sense may have helped Donald Trump come back through denying his cognitive decline and refusing to get out of the way. Then there's death. Even though we've done an amazing thing in postponing death for so many people, we can't, postpone it forever. So a remarkable fact is that many Democrats in Congress died in just the few months before Donald Trump tried to pass his latest big bill. He called it the One Big Beautiful Bill. And it made it easier for him to pass that bill because there were empty seats in Congress. But those are only the most obvious problems. I think the deeper problem is a failure of representation. Because even if you take out the oldest members of the federal government, including the judiciary, all of them are old. I mean, there are very few younger people in power. And that means that, like, the younger you are, the less your political leadership looks like you and represents you, at least insofar as your political preferences are age correlated, which they sometimes are. So I think the biggest objection is more uh, like representational unfairness. Okay, now on business leaders, I think it brings out something we should care about in general. But what's the point of being a business leader? Well, it's to innovate as in an evolving market. But we know that um, the older we are, the more, let's say, conservative with a small c we are, not politically, but we tend to have a more kind of repetitious intelligence rather than one that's about breakthrough or orthogonal moves. And there's that same concern about like fairness within a firm because the CEO could be aging and be blocking succession in the same way that like could happen in a political unit. But I think the business example brings out that another concern, which is about how do we achieve the proper balance in the distribution of power so that we access the more innovative intelligence that younger people and people in their prime tend to have, as opposed to the more conservative um, kind of approach to life that older people have. Amazingly, there's a study that shows that when younger CEOs in the United States die unexpectedly, the stock price goes down. Uh, Whereas when older CEOs finally leave their jobs, the stock price of the business goes up. And that means that the market agrees with me that it's like better for a firm to have a relatively younger leader, but often they don't. And the age of CEOs is trending old and older as time passes.
Dr. Samuel, one of the provocative themes in the book is that the grey lobby and older voters, by turning out more and funding campaigns, have reshaped political agendas around their own priorities. How does this dynamic actually play out in concrete policy domains like taxation, housing, and social spending?
Well, that's the heart of the book, and I have a whole section that's just about how old the voters are, and that's in part because there are so many elections, and young people only vote for the president, and older people go to every election, and they're not penalized the way young people are for being mobile because they're in their homes. They have power either as retirees or in their workplace to leave work to vote, whereas younger people typically don't. So older people dominate elections. They also have the biggest and best funded cause group in human history, I think, across all countries. Um, and that's called the AARP. And it's not like, it's a terrible organization. It does a lot of good things, but I think it's mainly an agent of stasis, in part because the politicians know who's in charge, who the voters are, and they just would never dare to cross older voters. A good example is the One Big Beautiful Bill, in which Donald Trump talked about cutting senior benefits, but in the end left them intact while cutting the benefits of poor children. So that's like an outright example of gerontocracy. As you say, in our system, we have no public funding of elections. So candidates also depend on donors, and those private donors are overwhelmingly old people. And so, for all of these reasons, we see a lot of outcomes that are not surprising because of who has influence in the political process. Take climate change, which we know that younger people think is the most important problem, and older voters and their cause groups feel like can be postponed. After all, they're not going to live through the worst of climate change. Um, Immigration is a really interesting one. The older that Americans are, the more hostile they are towards immigrants, which is very sad because it actually is setting their own interests back, since new immigrants would both work to pay for benefits for senior citizens, as well as actually do the work of providing the care that seniors need. And so all of these are examples of beyond the property one of the way that the elderliness of the political process is setting the country back. I think the worst example, and you also mentioned it, is the hostility of older people to tax, especially to tax on property. And so the housing story is kind of linked to this story of gerontocratic tax revolts. And sadly, property is extremely well protected, especially to the extent one's a senior citizen from taxation, whereas it should be the opposite because the older, and especially through their asset wealth, are the wealthiest Americans by many measures. And they're the ones who should be paying more tax rather than less. But the political crisis is such that they're able to get their way.
Professor, you argue that the tax code and the structure of the economy are rigged in favor of seniors, especially through preferential treatment of financial and housing assets. If a younger listener asks you for a simple explanation of how this mechanism work against them, what would you highlight first?
Well, it's a variation on the last answer that in I think many people still have memories of the Great Depression when there was no welfare state in this country, including for older people, at least at the federal level. And Franklin Roosevelt introduced Social Security in 1935, which is a benefit for retired Americans, when there were very few who lived very long. Um, but it was a crucial safeguard against elder poverty, which still exists, but much less flagrantly than in the past. And so, people have a memory, understandably, of older people as oppressed victims, especially if they can no longer work and save. Um, but we live in a radically different situation now. And the fact is that through the electoral system, there are so many older people who so dominate elections that they've been able to like retain a sense of uh, older people as living in precarity far longer than is justified. There are many older Americans who live precariously, but there are many others who are asset rich. Um, and we haven't really caught up in our assumptions to the reality of this transformation. And so it's really through their voting, through their cause group, through those mechanisms, campaign finance, that we see the rich getting richer, and those rich are frequently old because they've acquired and retained assets uh, without tax or without being forced to give back adequately to allow younger people and people in their prime to thrive in comparable ways.
Professor, many societies justify benefits for older people as a reward for a lifetime of contribution and sacrifice. How do you distinguish between legitimate protection for the vulnerable elderly and the kind of asset hoarding and policy capture that you see as central to American gerontocracy?
That's a really deep question, and I really appreciate it because it requires a lot of nuance. I've insisted that there are still way too many older people living in poverty or precarity, and we should do something about that, just as we should do something about children living in poverty and precarity, other than cutting their benefits. Um, but when we look at the data, it's just not fair to approach the problem as if all older Americans were like those who are living in precarity. For one thing, many people work by choice, uh, basically until they die. And that's another source of their class power, um, not just the assets they've acquired and are immunizing from tax. And I think it's really like a matter of drawing a line and saying, well, when we disaggregate older people, we need to see those who have successfully, through sacrifice and a lot of luck, acquired more than their fair share. We have to figure out how to incentivize them to give back. And that's the purpose of a tax code. Um, we can get into the details of how that would be done. On the housing front, I'm not, a communist who thinks we should expropriate the bourgeoisie or something like that. I do think we can justifiably use the tax code to identify those who have asset wealth that they don't need. And in the housing case, we could incentivize them through raising their property taxes rather than lowering them because they're old, to leave and downsize. Now, I also advocate in the book an expansion of federal welfare benefits on the grounds that I think it's reasonable for aging Americans when they don't have any guarantee of state-funded long-term care to retain their assets because they are going to live on average very long lives, and the state is not going to take care of them in the long run. And so my thought is that if they had the assurance that they would be taken care of however long they live, it would be reasonable to require them to give back sooner. Um, on the sacrifice point, I mean, I think we'd have to decide, is the like libertarian myth that Americans have that each of them earned what they have reasonable? And it's not. As I mentioned, there's a lot of luck. Many older people are wealthy just because of asset bubbles, especially in housing, and they have, through monopoly practices, it decreased the supply of housing or controlled the supply of housing precisely in order to favor their own house price and house value, even while refusing to vacate or pay tax. So I don't think the story that they're just like deserve all of their hard-won gains is very plausible.
Professor, the book doesn't just diagnose a problem, it sketches a program for dismantling elder power, from mandatory retirement ages to encouraging earlier intergenerational transfers of wealth. If you had to prioritize one reform that could realistically be implemented in the next decade, which would you choose and why?
Well, it's difficult because, I look across domains and I do look at the politicians and then I look at the voters and then I look at this story about wealth, including housing and jobs. And each one is its own problem. They're interrelated in a sense, but I think it's hard to say, well, there's one problem and we should try one solution. However, given what we've been talking about, it might make sense to begin with something easy, which is changing the way that Americans make land use decisions, which I mentioned are at these hyper local meetings that we know from studies that mainly older citizens attend. And if we, broke those sites of power up, we could have much greater supply of housing, which would allow newcomers to the market to, purchase, which they can't now.
Professor, you explore proposals that many listeners may find radical, such as giving greater electoral weight or voices to younger voters. What would you say to critics who fear these measures would violate basic democratic equality, and how do you justify them in terms of intergenerational fairness?
Well, thanks for the question. I just want to stress that I do offer almost like a laundry list of possible solutions. And, it's almost like a box of chocolates. You can choose one that you like. And I don't insist that you eat the whole box. Um, and many of the remedies I suggest are very modest, like, days off for voting so that younger people can more readily vote, or public finance of campaigns, which many states have, as you know. Um, so I think on the argument about changing the weight of votes, it's really a more philosophical issue. What does democracy require and how should we interpret equality? Should we get a vote if the same vote as others if we each have a body? Or is what really matters how many expected life years we have so that our vote is correlated with the stake we have in the election? For example, I might be living another 30 years and you might be living another 80 years. And it seems unequal for me to have the same say as you just because I have one body and you have one body. And so it's really a philosophical matter, first of all, to decide what democracy and equality require. But I also think we're dealing with gerontocracy. And so the question is, how do you correct for it, especially in circumstances where younger voters are so alienated from the gerontocratic political system that they don't bother voting? Well, in that circumstance, I think we can imagine, putting our thumb on the scale. And many people, when it comes to other social categories like gender or race, are very open to these kinds of interventions. So my question for them would be, if the inequalities around age are even worse now in many domains than those associated with gender and race, why would we not contemplate the same kind of creative thinking?
Professor, a powerful thread in the book is your argument that gerontocracy isn't just about institutions. It is also about a cultural ethos in which not today becomes a creed, and older elites refuse to let go of power, status, and position. What cultural or psychological shift would need to happen for aging to be reimagined as a stage of life oriented less toward clinging and more toward stewardship and letting go?
Well, it could happen in two directions. I think that there are many religious cultures around the world whose point is to say we are transient, and that we should think about ourselves cosmically as being here for a short time, and it ends. And one of the reasons, especially in kind of Christian thought, is that this is not your real life. There's allegedly another life coming, which could be eternal. Um, I hew more to a kind of secular approach, which is known as existentialism, which says we are are transient, and our lives are defined by their finitude. Um, but whether you're religious or secular, you could return to this kind of set of beliefs, and I think it would lead us to have more meaningful lives if we really focus not on the false promise of eternal life and more on the one life, at least on this earth, that we have to live, which is organized in stages, and took the last stage in which there's decline and greater risk of death, as both the chance to reinvent oneself one last time, as well as an opportunity to face one's mortality more forthrightly than most Americans do. So I think Americans do suffer from a denial of death and from other associated pathologies like the work ethic, which lead them to, uh, let's say, flee the reality that they have finite lives. And so I do have a part of the book which is about more of a cultural reorientation that I think would make countries not like mine not just more just, but people, flourish more than they do now.
Professor Samuel, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. For our business talk audience, leaders, professionals, and younger listeners navigating careers, you are essentially arguing that a fairer distribution of power and opportunity would benefit everyone, including many older people themselves. If you were speaking directly to CEOs, investors, and policymakers in the room, what is the one mindset shift about age and succession you would most want them to walk away with?
I think, beyond what we've just covered, I think I would just add that this is something that will get worse unless we act, because many societies other than sub-Saharan Africa are seeing their birth rates decline. So that means that life extension has inducted really all of humanity into a new experiment, which is a new demographic picture with more old people, absolutely and relatively. Uh, and I think the political consequences of that kind of uh, experiment are going to get more and more graphic. And so there's, in a sense, a need to act soon in order to begin to restore intergenerational fairness before it's impossible, because the stranglehold of older people over social priorities just becomes too intense.
Thank you, Professor Samuel Moyn, for a conversation that has been as unsettling as it is clarifying, and for helping us to see how age, power, and inequality are tightly intertwined in today's America. Your reflections on how we might redesign our institutions, our tax systems, and even our cultural expectations around aging offer not just critique but concrete sense of what a fairer intergenerational future could look like. For our listeners at Business Talk, we hope this episode prompts you to look again at who holds power in your own organization and communities, and what it would mean to open more space for the generations coming next. Professor Moyn, it has been a privilege to host you on the show. Thank you for sharing your work and your time with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.